If you genuinely believe your life is worth less than a clearance aisle television, you belong on today's list. This is an audit of extreme, unadulterated greed. We are exposing 10 times human beings made decisions so breathtakingly arrogant they were immediately removed from the gene pool. Let's watch exactly what happens when being cheap turns fatal. 1. Have you ever made a financial decision so terrible that it permanently canceled your earthly subscription? Meet Gary, a suburban deal hunter who viewed consumer electronics with the kind of fierce, protective reverence most sane individuals reserve for their firstborn children. Gary was a guy whose credit score was a running joke at his local bank, yet he treated a minor scuff on a flat-screen frame as a catastrophic life event. He had just emerged victorious from a soul-crushing retail blowout sale, securing a monstrous 75-inch smart television. Instead of paying a modest delivery fee, he crammed this fragile monolith into the back of his rusty sedan, securing it with a complex web of heavy-duty ratchet straps like he was transporting a captured dinosaur. Now, a quick refresher on terrestrial physics. A commercial freight train is a screaming horizontal skyscraper of solid steel, cruising at 60 miles per hour, and it possesses zero empathy for your unboxed home theater setup. The universe, flexing a rather dark sense of humor, stalled Gary's mechanical nightmare dead center on a rural railroad crossing, just as the crossing bells began their rhythmic death knell. The heavy wooden barriers descended, trapping his sedan in the worst parking spot on Earth. Any human with a functioning brain stem would immediately throw open the driver's door, sprint into the nearby brush, and get their phone out to film the impending vehicular explosion. But Gary looked down the tracks at the blinding headlight of an oncoming locomotive, then glanced at the pristine cardboard box in his rearview mirror, and made a calculation that set human evolution back a few centuries. He refused to abandon his prized purchase. Instead of bailing out, this champion of materialism climbed awkwardly over the center console, diving into the back seat to frantically dismantle the spiderweb of tension straps he had just installed. The train's horn shattered the evening air. The ground shook like an earthquake, but Gary was busy fighting a stubborn nylon buckle, entirely willing to trade his heartbeat to save a warranty. He actually managed to free one side of the box before he realized a fatal design flaw in his rescue mission. In his panicked thrashing, he had looped a heavy-duty strap tightly around his own ankle, tethering himself to the very appliance he was trying to save. He couldn't scramble out the door even if he wanted to. The locomotive introduced itself to the sedan a second later, converting Gary, his vehicle, and the television into a modern art installation of twisted metal and shattered pixel dust scattered across 3 miles of track. In a glorious twist of bureaucratic irony, the electronics retailer's automated billing system didn't care about his demise. Because the television was vaporized before he could register the serial number, his grieving estate spent the next 2 years paying off a financing plan for a magnificent screen that existed outside the store for a total of 18 minutes. 2. Picture a massive, forgotten industrial storage facility baking under a brutal summer sun, the exact kind of depressing real estate where terrible business plans go to die. This was the undisputed domain of Marcus, a self-certified hustle culture fanatic who watched way too many auction reality shows and convinced himself he was a master liquidator. Marcus possessed an aggressive aversion to physical labor, preferring to see himself as the brains of an operation that had 0 employees. He had just blown his life savings on the contents of an abandoned warehouse, which was essentially a nightmare labyrinth of precarious towers built from heavy wooden shipping crates. The previous owner clearly viewed OSHA safety guidelines as a mild suggestion, stacking boxes of dense mechanical parts 15 feet into the air on a rotting wooden floor. Basic load-bearing engineering dictates a simple rule. When you have thousands of pounds resting on a single base point, removing the foundation is the fastest way to summon gravity's wrath. While wandering through the dim, suffocating aisles, Marcus spotted his golden ticket. Crushed at the very bottom of a leaning tower of doom was a pristine, vintage mechanics tool cabinet, the kind that fetches a small fortune online. Anyone with even a remedial understanding of gravity would rent a forklift, spend the afternoon sweating, and unstack the column piece by piece. But forklifts cost money, and Marcus viewed every rental fee as a personal insult from the capitalist machine. So he skipped straight past the sensible option and landed on something truly spectacular. He formulated a strategy so breathtakingly stupid it belonged in a cartoon. He genuinely believed he could perform an industrial-scale version of the classic magician's tablecloth trick. He planned to grab the handles of the heavy tool cabinet and yank it out in one explosive motion, assuming the towering column of crates above would simply hover in midair for a second before dropping neatly down. He planted his boots on the greasy concrete, gripped the steel handles, ignored the terrifying creaks of stressed timber above his head, and pulled with all his greedy might. For one glorious fraction of a second, the cabinet shifted forward, making Marcus feel like a genius of logistics. But reality immediately stepped in. The massive stack of crates, filled with solid brass plumbing fixtures, registered the sudden lack of structural support and collapsed downward with the thunderous fury of a localized earthquake. The industrial rain instantly pancaked Marcus against the floor, transforming the aspiring mogul into a two-dimensional cautionary tale about cutting corners. The grand finale to his entrepreneurial career was uncovered by the paramedics a few hours later. They pried open the valuable tool cabinet he died to retrieve, only to find it was packed to the brim with heavy-duty hydraulic jacks and steel support beams, the exact equipment he would have needed to safely brace the ceiling and survive the afternoon. 3. Some people dream of winning the lottery, but Todd preferred the illusion of earning his wealth through sheer stubbornness and an intense misunderstanding of outdoor survival. Todd was a weekend prospector who treated Mother Nature like a broken vending machine. He was convinced that if he just shook the wilderness hard enough, a massive payout would eventually drop into his lap. He spent his weekends wading through the freezing, aggressive currents of remote mountain rivers, driven by a feverish gold rush mentality that entirely bypassed his brain's danger receptors. The mechanics of his impending doom perfectly mirrored a primitive hunting snare known as the monkey trap. You place a sweet treat inside a heavy jar with a narrow neck. The animal reaches in, grabs the food, makes a fist, and suddenly cannot pull its hand back out through the tight opening. Because the creature is too greedy to just let go of the prize, it remains anchored to the spot. Todd was about to play the role of the monkey with zero rehearsal. Snorkeling in a treacherous stretch of rapids, he experienced a blinding moment of euphoria. Wedged deep beneath the jagged base of a massive granite boulder was a chunk of raw, shimmering metal the size of a grapefruit. Without factoring in basic geometry or the limits of his lung capacity, Todd shoved his right arm shoulder-deep into the dark, incredibly narrow underwater crevice. His fingers eagerly wrapped around the prize, but as he tried to pull his haul back to the surface, he hit a biological snag. His tightly closed fist, wrapped around a dense rock, was now an inch wider than the stone tunnel. He had created a perfect flesh-and-bone wedge. The solution was embarrassingly simple. Relax your hand, drop the rock, swim to the surface, and catch your breath. Maybe grab a crowbar later. Instead, blinded by the intoxicating promise of sudden wealth, his brain absolutely refused to authorize a retreat. He began fighting the rock, violently yanking his arm backward. This panicked thrashing only forced his knuckles deeper into the narrowing bottleneck, jamming his wrists so tight he might as well have been cemented in place. His lungs burned. The freezing water sapped his core temperature, yet he stubbornly held a death grip on his treasure, fiercely kicking his legs while refusing to unclench his fingers. He literally let the freezing river permanently claim him rather than surrender his payout for 10 seconds. The bewildered county dive team chiseled him out of the riverbed the next morning and found the ultimate punchline to his greed, waiting right there in his fist. Todd was frozen stiff, still fiercely clutching his prize. It was a massive, worthless lump of iron pyrite, a shiny trick of geology that the universe, in a final act of mockery, calls fool's gold. 4. Nothing triggers the magnificent, instantaneous collapse of basic human dignity quite like a bag of untraceable cash blowing across a busy pedestrian crosswalk. Kevin was a corporate drone whose ethical compass was magnetically aligned to pure greed. If a toddler dropped a shiny quarter, he would treat it as a hostile business acquisition and tackle the kid to the pavement. One rainy Tuesday, a banking courier in an adjacent high-rise fumbled a leather satchel, sending a localized blizzard of high-denomination bills raining down onto the wet street. While normal pedestrians paused in shock, Kevin transformed into a feral financial vacuum. He abandoned his coffee and crawled across the soggy asphalt, furiously stuffing crumpled hundreds into his trousers, his shirt collar, and his tailored suit jacket until he resembled a severely bloated piñata. He had easily hoarded enough corporate funds to finance a quiet retirement. The smart play was to walk away and count the loot. But Kevin's radar locked onto one final, solitary piece of paper fluttering gracefully toward an open municipal sewer shaft. The utility workers had thoughtfully surrounded this concrete abyss with bright orange cones, which Kevin treated as a personal finish line tape. When you combine extreme avarice with terribly impractical footwear, the unforgiving physics become absolutely undeniable. Kevin's suit was now weighed down by several pounds of dense paper, completely destroying his center of gravity. Furthermore, the sheer volume of cash jammed into his armpits physically pinned his elbows to his sides, turning his torso into a stiff, immovable log. As he leaned out over the dark, echoing chasm to pinch the edge of that final bill, the smooth leather soles of his expensive Italian loafers met the rain-slicked iron rim of the manhole. He didn't just slip. His feet rocketed into the stratosphere like he had stepped on a greased anvil. Because his arms were immobilized by his own stolen fortune, he couldn't reach out to grab the asphalt. Kevin plunged headfirst down the vertical concrete pipe, accelerating rapidly into the subterranean darkness until he made a sudden, terminal introduction with the reinforced drainage grate at the bottom. The abrupt stop instantly liquidated his assets and his mortal existence. The paramedics spent an hour running a winch system to hoist his wealthy remains out of the sludge. As they loaded him up, the cruelest punchline in the universe gracefully floated down onto the wet pavement beside the ambulance. The wind had blown that single, elusive bill back up to the surface. A cop picked it up and realized it wasn't even legal tender. It was a highly realistic promotional flyer for a local discount mattress warehouse. Kevin had literally traded his life for a 20% off coupon on a twin-sized memory foam mattress. 5. There is a very specific breed of rural cheapskate who views the concept of making 2 trips as a direct insult to their sheer masculinity. Arthur was an aging hobby farmer who operated under the grand delusion that the laws of physics were just polite suggestions for cowards. He had managed to cultivate a freakish bumper crop of exceptionally dense, prize-winning pumpkins. The annual autumn farmers market was located exactly 3 miles away, conveniently situated at the very bottom of a notoriously steep mountain road. Renting a utility trailer would have cost him $40 and a signature. Arthur stared at a literal metric ton of agricultural mass, glanced at his rusted, 30-year-old moped that already struggled to carry a single adult up a driveway, and said, "Yeah, that'll work." He didn't just load the scooter. He methodically constructed a mobile prison of gourds around his own body. He strapped massive sacks to the fragile handlebars, bungee-corded a leaning tower onto the rear rack, and stuffed the floorboard until his knees were pinned to his chest. Finally, he wedged a massive 50-pound pumpkin directly into his lap, locking his legs in place so tightly he couldn't even twitch. He had successfully transformed a lightweight recreational toy into an unstable, top-heavy agricultural missile. Now, let us discuss the science of cheap mechanical friction. A vintage moped utilizes tiny drum brakes designed strictly to halt 200 pounds at a gentle coast. Arthur was piloting nearly 1,000 pounds of fleshy and fibrous mass. As he cheerfully crested the mountain peak and began his descent down the punishing 15-degree grade, gravity realized what a phenomenal opportunity it had been handed. The overloaded scooter accelerated wildly. As the first sharp hairpin turn approached, Arthur confidently squeezed both brake levers. The tiny brake pads pressed against the spinning drums and instantly surrendered, vaporizing into a screaming cloud of blue smoke. The sheer weight of the harvest glazed the metal smooth in a fraction of a second. The brakes ceased to exist. Panic finally pierced Arthur's stubborn skull, but because he had brilliantly barricaded his own limbs behind hundreds of pounds of strapped-down vegetables, he couldn't stick his boots out to drag along the asphalt or bail off the doomed machine. He was merely a captive passenger on a runaway squash rocket, hurtling down the mountain at highway speeds. He entirely missed the turn, launching the moped off the steep embankment like a sad orange comet. He soared over the steel guardrail and impacted the rocky ravine, instantly buried beneath the overwhelming weight of his own harvest. The county fair officials visited the wreckage site the next morning, and because bureaucracy waits for no man, they officially awarded Arthur the blue ribbon for the heaviest crop yield. The highway patrol literally had to bring in an industrial crane scale to weigh the chaotic debris field just to determine why a vintage moped had snapped a reinforced steel barrier. 6. The suburban landscape is crawling with deeply delusional weekend warriors who genuinely believe professional contractors are just elaborate scams designed to separate a man from his cash. Meet Greg, the undisputed king of catastrophic do-it-yourself disasters, a man who approached home improvement with the aggressive confidence of a structural engineer despite possessing the spatial awareness of a stunned pigeon. Greg decided his backyard desperately needed an in-ground swimming pool. Instead of hiring an insured excavation crew, he rented a massive diesel mini excavator to dig the 10-foot-deep crater himself, determined to save a fortune in labor. Digging the actual hole was only the first half of the equation. The second, far more expensive problem was the removal of the earth. Hauling away tons of displaced clay requires renting dumpsters and paying hefty landfill disposal fees, a concept that violently offended Greg's miserly soul. He formulated a budget-saving strategy so profoundly idiotic, it practically guaranteed his removal from the gene pool. Instead of moving the dirt away from the site, Greg simply swung the mechanical arm and dumped every single scoop right onto the immediate edge of the freshly dug trench. He spent 12 hours enthusiastically building a towering artificial mountain range of loose soil completely surrounding the perimeter of an unsupported pit. Allow me to offer a terrifying lesson in soil mechanics. A single cubic yard of wet earth weighs roughly 2,000 pounds, which is the equivalent of a compact car. Greg had effortlessly stacked the weight of 30 sedans directly on top of the most fragile vertical shear plane in his entire yard. The dirt wall of the trench was screaming under the immense unnatural pressure, held together by nothing but temporary friction and blind luck. Once the hole was excavated, Greg turned off the machinery and proudly surveyed his deeply flawed kingdom. He noticed a few minor bumps at the absolute bottom of the 10-foot abyss. Refusing to let an imperfection ruin his masterpiece, he grabbed a small metal hand trowel, completely ignored the ominous shadows of the dirt mountains towering directly above his skull, and jumped down into the pit to manually smooth the floor. The moment his heavy work boots struck the bottom, that tiny seismic vibration was the exact catalyst the overloaded soil had been waiting for. The laws of physics abruptly canceled Greg's backyard paradise. Without a single sound of warning, the entire perimeter wall sheared off, surrendering to the crushing weight of the free dirt pile above. In less than a second, an avalanche of 30 tons of dark, suffocating clay collapsed inward, burying Greg alive beneath 12 solid feet of earth and trapping him at the absolute bottom of his own custom-made disaster. He didn't even have time to drop his trowel before 30 tons of saturated clay entombed him where he stood. The ultimate tragedy of his cheap life occurred 3 days later. The city rescue teams couldn't use heavy machinery without risking further collapse, meaning his widow was legally forced to hire the exact same premium excavation contractors Greg had stubbornly refused to pay. They billed his estate an astronomical emergency rate just to safely haul away the mountain of dirt and retrieve what was left of him. 7. A standard 8-inch ice auger hole is a beautifully engineered portal for pulling out panfish, perch, and the occasional modest walleye. It is absolutely, categorically, not designed to accommodate a 100-pound bottom-dwelling monster, but nobody bothered to share that memo with Wade. Wade was the self-appointed emperor of a desolate Minnesota lake, a man who believed hauling a massive aquatic beast through a frozen surface validated his entire existence. It was January on a desolate Minnesota lake where the ambient temperature could flash freeze spit. Wade was sitting on a plastic bucket, determined to rip a mythological monster from the pitch-black depths. He had augured a standard 8-inch portal through 3 feet of solid ice, dropping down a heavy-duty braided synthetic line capable of towing a small sedan. After hours of shivering, his rod violently doubled over. He hooked an absolute prehistoric leviathan, a bottom-dwelling catfish with the muscular density of a torpedo. Wade fought this invisible demon until he muscled the exhausted beast directly beneath his boots, only to discover a catastrophic geographical flaw. The heavily whiskered head of the catfish was literally twice the diameter of his tiny drilled hole. It was geometrically impossible to drag his prize onto the frozen surface. Cut the line. Walk away. Tell the story at every bar in the county for the rest of your natural life. That is the play. But Wade's brain was running entirely different software, infected with a fatal case of angler's greed that refused to let a 100-pound trophy escape over a minor mathematical inconvenience. Desperate to keep tension on the fish while freeing both hands to grab his heavy steel ice chisel, he formulated a plan that defied every known law of personal safety. He took the slack end of the braided line and tied it in a complex knot directly around his right wrist, essentially handcuffing himself to a panicked submarine. He began frantically hacking at the edges of the portal, raining ice chips everywhere. Here is a fun, aggressively fatal fact about marine biology. A giant catfish is an ambush predator that generates incredible bursts of kinetic energy. The second Wade chipped away enough ice to widen the hole to a foot. The massive fish saw its escape route and bolted straight down for the murky bottom with the horsepower of a motorcycle. The heavy line snapped taut with a sickening crack, violently yanking Wade off his bucket and dragging him face-first onto the slick ice. The knot tightened instantly, and the sheer force yanked his entire right arm straight down into the freezing black water. He was pulled forward until his thick winter coat and shoulder wedged brutally against the jagged edges of the chopped hole. He was completely pinned, trapped acting as a human bobber for a mutant fish. His bulky insulated snowsuit entirely prevented his free hand from reaching the pocket knife clipped to his hip. Wade met his icy end right there, permanently anchored to the surface by his own unyielding greed. When game wardens chiseled his frozen remains out of the lake 3 days later, they discovered the ultimate mocking punchline. The line was intact, but the catfish had spit the hook out hours after Wade died, meaning he sacrificed his life for absolutely nothing. 8. A brand new titanium smartphone. $1,200 of sleek engineering, Gorilla Glass, and dopamine delivery. For most people, it is a communication device. For Tyler, it was a sacred religious artifact requiring constant physical contact, the one possession he would cross any line to protect. Tyler was a cheap suburbanite whose entire identity lived inside that glowing rectangle. His house featured a steeply pitched, 3-story roof covered in aging asphalt shingles, currently coated in a treacherous layer of wet leaves, slimy algae, and the damp aftermath of a morning rainstorm. He climbed a wobbly aluminum ladder to perform the grudging maintenance of clearing overflowing gutters. Because Tyler was utterly incapable of unplugging from the digital matrix for 20 minutes, his premium device was perched precariously in the shallow chest pocket of his flannel shirt while he scooped out rotting debris. As he leaned over to clear a stubborn clump of pine needles, gravity intervened. The sleek titanium rectangle slid out of his pocket, clattered against the aluminum gutter, and defied the odds by coming to a complete stop. It rested perfectly balanced on the outer lip of the drainage trough, teetering over a 30-foot drop to the concrete driveway below. The intelligent response would be to climb down the ladder, retrieve a long pool skimmer net from the garage, or swallow his pride and call a local roofer to safely retrieve the uninsured device. But every fiber of Tyler's being rejected any solution involving patience or financial expenditure, consumed by a primal greed to rescue his metallic baby. Refusing to fetch a rope or even change out of his tractionless rubber gardening clogs, Tyler decided to army crawl down the slick, algae-covered slope of the roof, completely unanchored. He banked on the delusional belief that his core strength could somehow override the coefficient of wet algae on asphalt shingle. Wet asphalt shingles essentially act like a slip-and-slide, manufactured out of lubricated sandpaper. As Tyler inched his body down the steep incline, he actually managed to reach the absolute edge, extending his arm to within an inch of his precious phone. However, in his desperate stretching motion, he shifted his center of gravity past his own knees. The slick rubber of his clogs lost their microscopic grip on the algae, and his body instantly converted into a fleshy, uncontrolled toboggan. Traction dropped to absolute zero. Tyler rapidly accelerated down the final 3 feet of the roof, his frantic fingernails failing to find purchase on the wet shingles. He launched spectacularly off the third-story eaves, flying through the air before making a terminal introduction with his concrete driveway. The abrupt impact entirely deleted his consciousness from the universe, permanently curing his smartphone addiction. The paramedics who arrived to clean up the messy aftermath were treated to a beautiful display of irony. The phone he sacrificed his life for had been gently nudged by his flailing arm as he fell, dropping safely into a soft pile of damp leaves in the flower bed below. It survived without a scratch, merrily lighting up with missed calls while Tyler was loaded into the back of an ambulance. 9. The fiercely competitive subculture of reclaimed wood enthusiasts is completely overrun by delusional DIYers who genuinely believe that dismantling century-old agricultural architecture is a casual weekend hobby rather than a highly dangerous demolition operation. Chuck was an arrogant handyman obsessed with outfitting his home with rustic aesthetics, but he was violently allergic to paying the premium prices demanded by architectural salvage yards. He purchased a dilapidated 100-year-old dairy barn on a crumbling rural property for pennies, convinced he had struck the mother lode of timber. His absolute crown jewel, the prize his greedy eyes were fixated upon, was the massive, flawless central oak load-bearing pillar standing vertically in the middle of the structure. Basic engineering dictates that a roof consisting of thousands of heavy slate tiles relies entirely on this central pillar to keep gravity from asserting dominance. Scaffolding, weeks of careful tile removal, a slow, methodical top-down disassembly. That is how a licensed contractor handles a job like this, and that is exactly why Chuck refused to do any of it. He looked at this terrifyingly unstable wooden house of cards, calculated the time and money he would save by skipping every safety step, and allowed his relentless greed to override his survival instincts. He formulated a demolition plan so staggeringly idiotic it felt like a rejected cartoon script. Standing directly underneath the rotting roof, Chuck decided to use a heavy reciprocating saw and a 20-pound steel sledgehammer to attack the base of the pillar. He operated under the magnificent cinematic delusion that once he severed the main support, he would have a solid 3 seconds to execute a flawless action hero dive out the barn door before the building realized it was supposed to collapse. He genuinely believed human reflexes could outrun gravitational acceleration. He fired up the saw, ignoring the terrifying cracks echoing from the stressed timber directly above his skull. He sawed through 90% of the wood, then picked up his sledgehammer to deliver the final blow to claim his free prize. He swung the hammer with all his might, shattering the remaining splinters. The massive oak pillar shifted, detaching from its foundation. However, Chuck immediately discovered a critical flaw in his timeline. Structural collapse does not operate on a dramatic delay. The absolute microsecond the load support was removed, the entire 2-ton slate roof instantly surrendered to gravity, dropping downward at 32 feet per second squared. Chuck didn't even have time to blink, let alone execute a heroic dive. The ceiling violently pancaked the floor in a blinding cloud of dust, instantly converting the frugal handyman into a permanent structural addition trapped beneath the centuries-old floorboards. When the fire department brought in excavators 3 days later to sift through the catastrophic mountain of splintered wood, they found Chuck resting at the absolute bottom of the ruins. The perfectly intact, beautiful reclaimed oak beam he had just sacrificed his life for was resting comfortably right on top of him, using his flattened remains as the most useless shock absorber in architectural history. 10. How much free seafood would it take for you to voluntarily drown yourself? $50 worth? 100? Because Jerry apparently ran that exact calculation and decided the math checked out. Jerry was a stubbornly cheap coastal scavenger whose penny pinching was matched only by his absolute refusal to understand oceanic displacement. He was a connoisseur of the low tide, wading miles out into the mudflats to harvest free crustaceans, viewing the ocean merely as an unguarded complimentary buffet. One evening, Jerry waded deep into the bay during an extreme minus tide with a massive commercial nylon crab net. Because carrying a net rapidly filling with dense sea creatures is exhausting, Jerry employed a life hack born of pure laziness. He took the thick drawstring of the net and tied it securely around his leather belt with a quadruple. incredibly tight fisherman's knot. This tethered him to his catch so he could use both hands to snatch up more free dinner. Jerry was having the harvest of a lifetime, blinded by the greedy calculation of his savings, eventually packing his submerged net with nearly 90 pounds of heavily shelled crabs. However, Jerry was so focused on his underwater accounting that he completely ignored the rapid shift in the currents. A spring tide was rushing back into the shallow basin with the aggressive speed of a flooding river. Within minutes, the water surged past his knees and climbed toward his waist. The life-preserving action was obvious. Unbuckle the belt, abandon the sack of seafood, and sprint back to the shoreline. But as the water reached his chest, Jerry ran a catastrophic cost-benefit analysis right there in the rising surf. He estimated the market value of the writhing profit tethered to his waist and made the conscious decision that his life was not worth abandoning the catch. He refused to unbuckle his belt. Instead, he decided to swim back to shore while dragging an anchor made of 90 pounds of terrified crustaceans. Basic aquatic buoyancy dictates a very harsh reality. Tying a massive bag of dense calcium carbonate shells to your waist is the exact recipe the mafia uses to dispose of informants. As Jerry desperately tried to doggy paddle toward the beach, the massive weight of the waterlogged net instantly dragged his lower half straight down into the murky depths. The current swept his feet out from under him, plunging his head below the choppy surface. Panic finally set in, but the soaked heavy nylon rope, pulled taut by dead weight, had fused the complex knot into a solid lump of hardened fiber. The extreme tension on his belt physically prevented him from unlatching the buckle. He thrashed violently, screaming bubbles into the dark water, but the anchor of his own greed held him firmly against the muddy bottom. Jerry ultimately lost his battle against the current just a few hundred yards from the beach, permanently anchored to the ocean floor by a bag of crabs. When the Marine unit pulled him onto the dock the next afternoon, they discovered poetic oceanic justice. The knot was perfectly secured to his belt, but the crabs had used their powerful claws to shred the nylon mesh from the inside out. They easily escaped back into the bay, leaving Jerry as a permanent fixture of the ocean floor, tethered to an empty, worthless, torn piece of string. Let's settle this in the comments. If you had to put one of these 10 absolute disasters on a billboard to warn humanity about the dangers of greed, whose specific failure gets the spotlight? Give me your best argument. If you enjoyed watching people negotiate with gravity and lose, hit subscribe and drop a like so the algorithm knows you aren't completely broke.